that to learn about framing is to learn a little bit about how media is structured and how political communication affects people. But it is also a very interesting case study of how theories are handled in our field and how theories develop in our field. So even if you are not directly working with framing, and I think many of you won't be directly working with framing, I think there's quite a lot of illustrative examples here of how theories develop in political communication or in communication science more broadly. And so therefore, I also think it's a very interesting example of how theoretical development works in our field. And I hope to be able to illustrate some of these developments today. So what will I talk about today? Actually, the framing theory or framing effects theory story has quite a nice arc. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the origins of it. I won't bore you too much with, the historical, development of it. I'll talk a little bit about that, but mostly about how did framing develop to be a very central theory in political communication research and communication research more broadly. And then why is it not today? Because I would actually start with saying that today it isn't anymore one of the most popular theories that we use. It might be to students when you try to let them understand how public discourse is formed and how it works. But actually not a lot of scholars use it anymore these days in their research on political communication, and specifically when they study digital disruptions of political communication. And then I'll, of course, end a little bit with the question of future applications. And then I'm really looking forward to hear a little bit your feedbacks and your impression of what framing might be able to do for our field. And there's another thing that this talk is actually illustrating, is that you might be finishing your PhD dissertation, for those of you who are PhD students, and might be thinking, I will never think about this topic again because I'm fed up and I've had enough of this. And this will never be true. You will never be able to forget it, because I finished my dissertation that was titled Framing Politics in 2010. So that's a long time ago. And actually haven't done a lot of framing research since. And not a lot, I mean, some, but not a lot. And I'm talking about it. So apparently I can't forget, or people don't let me forget. So whatever you're studying in your dissertation will haunt you forever. Sorry. But I'm happy actually to talk about it because I still like it. And, am I still happy with the design I chose for the first, for the title of my dissertation? I don't know. But back then I thought it was cool. But I'm very happy that I got to study framing. And my dissertation was not really about a particular topic or a particular political context, but I really tried to advance framing effects theory with the central question of how long do framing effects last? And that's the question I've focused on most, and I will also come back to during my talk. All right, so let's talk about where framing comes from. So I don't have to tell this to you, but you all know that framing is a part of communication theory, but it is also a part of many other social sciences and even beyond that. And it is particularly also a very important theory that practitioners use to try to explain media impact. Arguably, I would say specifically the focus that practitioners like PR professionals, journalists, and other people who are involved in communication have on framing kind of feedbacks it back into research again and again. This idea, this belief that the way we tell stories has specific effects on how people believe the story or how people follow our story is, of course, a very compelling one. And it is at the very core of what communication science does. And that's why framing, I would argue, is so popular. But very specifically, framing comes from two main fields, two other social sciences. And the first one is sociology. And that's a tradition that is very, very prominent also in political communication. It's a sociological idea of frames as these type of ways people use to interpret complex realities. And obviously that appeals to us in political communication because there's the assumption that politics is a complex topic that people might not be able to understand in all instances, or that is very prone to disinformation or misunderstandings. So this idea that frames are basically heuristics humans use to understand complex worlds is very appealing. So Irving Jofman's frame analysis, but also other sociologists' work from the 70s and 80s has really kind of led to, yeah?
Sorry, Sophie, the slides are not moving.
Oh, they're not moving?
No.
Oh, okay, that's bad. Can you see them here then?
Yeah, now we can see.
That's interesting. Okay.
Sorry.
I made such nice slides. So you were still on the first slide, and I showed
Yeah,
you.
sorry,
I thought I'd gone through
for the
well, you were very polite to wait that long.
Yeah, sorry.
And the slides are also not yet in presenter mode, I think.
And now they are not. No, now I stopped that.
Okay.
Maybe I'll just stay like this. Is that okay? So that we don't have to like discuss around. Okay. So this is what I said earlier about today's journey, right? So talk about the origin, then about kind of how was framing become so important, and then the decline of it. This is what I wanted to show you earlier. This was the dissertation I wrote on framing politics, and then I came to the origin story. So what I was just talking about is sociology and Irving Joffman's frame analysis, and this idea that framing appeals to many political communication scholars because it is about reduction of complexity. This idea that frames are used to really understand complex and very ununderstandable things, so to say. But the second origin of framing effects in our field comes from psychology. And actually, a lot of research that we use comes from psychology. You know this, right? So, and this is actually also where my research is most based on. And that's prospect theory by Kamen and Tversky, which is research that won a Nobel Prize for these two scholars later on, where they showed that people make arguably slightly irrational decision at times. So when presented with the same information, they called it the Asian disease problem. So the idea is that, in some instances, we highlight that some people can survive. And in another instance, we highlight that some people can actually will die from an illness or from a cure to an illness. Then people react very differently, even though the information that's provided is essentially the same. And what has come from that is something that's called gain and loss framing that is used across many different disciplines, also in many sub-disciplines of communication research, such as media psychology, health communication, and so on. But it's also been very important in political communication. Again, I would argue because quite often in political decision-making, we are kind of facing a gain and loss scenario where, for example, opposing political candidates try to reinterpret the same political context into their advantage or to the disadvantage of another candidate. So these dichotomies of framing something in terms of gain or loss also works quite well for a political logic. So these sociological and psychological origins really predispositions, so to say, framing theory to be a great success in communication science, because they let us understand that complex things sometimes can be made easy by certain frames, certain ideas people have, certain heuristics or shortcuts people use, and they let us understand why sometimes in response to complex information, people react differently, even if it's the same information. These are the two kind of initial ideas that really inspired communication scholars and political communication scholars to bring the theory into the field. And then it was adapted, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about that adaptation. How did that work? Because I think it's quite important for what happened next, which was the fact that framing actually went into a rapid decline after that. And the first wave of adaptation that happened in political communication research of framing was through a couple of scholars, and one in particular, and that's Robert Entman. And I can tell you that I have read the citation that you see here at the very top, the short quote, to frame is to select some aspects and so on, so many times in the last 20 years in various student papers, in journal articles I reviewed, in books, that I almost have a physical reaction to it now. Cannot see this anymore, right? But it is, of course, one of the first very, very understandable definitions of what framing and what framing effects actually are, is that there are some aspects that are a frame and other aspects that are not a frame. Because when people first started thinking about framing in political communication research, they liked this idea that we have these heuristics, these schemes in our heads, and that they make us act irrationally. That explained a lot of things we were seeing in politics and political communication. But then the very right question came up. Where somebody was saying, well, okay, then where are these frames? Like, how can we make them observable? Because we are, of course, at the very heart an empirical discipline. So we want to measure frames and we want to measure framing effects, right? So then people said, well, how can we see these frames? And then people like Ant-Man, but also other scholars came in and said, well, actually you can see them because there are these kind of ideas that are highlighted in certain arguments, and they make you look for these type of specific, very coherent things, these themes, these actors, these causal interpretations, and we can actually measure them in content analysis or wherever. And this is where this first wave of adaptation came in. They made frames observable and measurable for us in communication, in text, in visuals, and then made it also observable for us to see the effects of being exposed to such texts on citizens. And Shanto Iyengar, for example, is one of the first ones who then came up with, his book here is also shown with this idea of frames that are repeated all the time. And he started talking about so-called episodic and thematic framing, where he said, well, actually, these frames, they are not always new, but they're journalists or communicators used the same frames over and over again, specifically by putting political topics either in an episodic context, so say talking about specific individuals, how they deal with certain political challenges, or it is more thematic, contextual ideas of, so and so many people don't have jobs or stuff like that. And these were the more fundamental frames mediated communication was showing. So this is the kind of first adaptation, and that's the adaptation that I was based on. I see there's another hand up. Can you not see me?
No, I think we're still on the first adaptation slide, but I think you're
yes,
already...
that was also true. That we are still
okay.
on that. I'm still on that slide.
Okay,
yes.
I thought you mentioned the third step in adaptation, but I might be wrong.
No, the first.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, don't worry. You're good to question it, because there was a problem with the slides. And then there was so then we kind of started to understand a little bit, okay, this is what frames are. We started to get an idea. And I'll come back to how that was then again problematic later in a bit. And then the second adaptation step was, okay, then how can we observe the effects of this even? And I'm sure a lot more of you are interested in the effects of frames on people, in experiments or in other kind of contexts that you might want to study. And that was actually a decade-long process in which this was adapted, mostly by people like, Dietram Schäufele, Claese Frese, and others, but more specifically those who took more from the psychological paradigms of framing, where they said, well, there is these processes of how people adapt these heuristics, these frames from the media into their brains or into their minds. And there we come to this very fundamental idea that framing is a process. So it's not just there's a frame and it has an effect, but framing can be observed at every stage of the process. There are people who build frames or contexts in which frames are built either by political elites or by media. And then these frames are visible in discourse. And then we can also make them visible in people's minds by, for example, asking them about them or by seeing how they react to an increased salience of these frames in the media they use. And people like Thomas Nelson and colleagues then said, well, there's this kind of process of applicability and accessibility. I'll come back to that in a second. This idea that frames are not actually created in people's minds, but they're already there, and they're just made and pushed to the front once they see this frame also in media. And again, for political communication scholars in particular, this was very that, because in our field, which is very much inspired by political science, and I watched a video by Renz talking about political science and communication science, we are continuously trying to prove that mediated impact is actually relatively small versus other political variables, such as partisanship and other things that matter for people's reactions to an election or whatever. So we're trying to say, okay, well, yeah, media might change how people vote, but actually how the political ideology is formed, that also matters, or matters even more, right? And this works quite well with the idea of existing frames in people's minds, because this idea that, okay, somebody already has an idea about immigration in their mind, and then it's simply just made accessible for them through the media, but it was already there because of their inclinations towards immigration that they had formed based on their history, their peers' information, their family, their education, or whatnot. So again, it worked quite well to very limit this idea that frames have very strong effects here, and talk about these quite subtle effects in the second adaptation. And then the third and probably long kind of last step before the decline of the theory was this idea, okay, we need some sort of model of framing effects, and then we have to really ask ourselves, how strong are these effects really? And when I was writing my PhD, I was involved in a lot of quite aggressive discussions through reviews and in conferences where people were trying to tell me that framing effects are incredibly short-lived and incredibly weak and incredibly small, and it cannot be shown. And this was all a problem of the experiments. I'll come back to that in a second and go so on, but that they're actually non-existent. Yeah. In my research, I found that they are actually quite substantial and they can be quite long-lasting depending on the conditions under which they emerge. And this was not just found in my research, but by a number of other people, for example, by Chong and Druckmann, whom many of you know, I'm sure, as people who've written a lot on framing. When they said, well, when the conditions are right, meaning that we have a moment of resonance when a frame is being built, so a frame fits into a zeitgeist or into a public discourse structure, and when it hits people at a moment when the attitudes are being formed, which is quite often the case in politics because we have a lot of new things coming up, and when they get repeated exposure, which is also something that happens quite often because people have a lot of media use, then we can create lasting framing impact. And this has been shown empirically as well. So actually framing effects are not negligible, but there certain conditions need to be met for them to be lasting. So far so good, right? Sounds good. We have a good idea what frames are. We have a good idea how the effects work. We can measure them. We're happy, right? We're happy. We weren't happy. We weren't happy for various reasons. One reason were there were other theories that were clashing with framing at the time of the development, and most prominently agenda setting and priming, which were also in their real prime, sorry for the repeated word use, in the kind of late 2000s, so to say, when framing was developed, specifically agenda setting, which developed into second level agenda setting, and this idea that it's basically the same as framing. Let's not go into this discussion. I was forced to never cite these people by my supervisor, but there was a lot of debate about that. And I actually, in the end, didn't think it was so much of a problem because agenda setting in its essence tried to explain very different dynamics, right? More on a macro level. But even when it went to the micro level, it had a little bit of a different priority. It didn't really try to understand so much people's frames in their minds, but more about what people prioritized in certain aspects. And priming actually from the beginning was a very limited concept and is now not used, at least political priming, not used so much anymore because it was specifically focused on political candidates and how political candidates are made more accessible in people's minds. But specifically agenda setting, which I would argue also is not so hot anymore these days, was clashing at the time with framing a little bit, and the kind of theories developed at the same time, and there was a lot of debate. And I remember once that I wrote an article, and then at the end I wrote, but this and this author said that the same structure, same process can be observed using agenda setting. And then one of the co-authors asked me to please change the word suggested into speculated. So they speculate that agenda setting is the same. So there were a lot of debates about what the better theory was, but this happens sometimes in academia and it's not so meaningful, but I think they actually complement each other quite well. And from a perspective of 10 years later, I think I'm more able to understand that. And then framing was used a lot. It was used so much that when I first assisted somebody in making an ICA program in 2010 or 11, we had a panel called Framing, More Framing. And we had, I think in a PolCom division at ICA, at least 3, 4, 5 panels who only dealt exclusively with framing research. When I became the chair of the division some years later, I had absolutely no panel on framing anymore. In about 2020 and so on. So the decline was actually rapid, but in around 2008, 2012, framing was, from an academic point of view, a real success story, and people used it a lot. And people used it a lot for the reasons I told you about. The idea that it helps us understand why highlighting certain small things leads to quite a lot of effects. It helps us understand why people have this need to reduce be used from so many angles, from the production angles, from the usage angles, from the effect angles, and that's why people loved it. And then people started hating it. And people started hating it in about 2015, more or less, for various reasons. And I want to go through them because they are very legitimate arguments that can limit the usage of framing in your studies as well. The first one, and the probably most profound one, was the idea that people were fundamentally doubting what a frame really is. So the way I had adapted news frames was more to focus on so-called emphasis framing, where this idea that we have very distinguishable ideas in political communication that can be used, to understand all sorts of different political topics. And sometimes you have like quite generic frames that come again and again, like in elections, strategy framing, for example, and stuff like that. But in essence, we could build frames around everything. But then there was a second kind of school of thought developing, specifically led by people from the US, Iyengar, Schäufele, where they were saying, well, actually, this is diluting the concept too much. The idea comes from prospect theory, and prospect theory is based on equivalency. We need equivalency of information. So this is the classic idea of a yogurt is 97% fat-free or has 3% fat. This is what framing is. And if we use framing in a more kind of wider sense, like everything can be a frame or not, then basically we make it meaningless and we can't compare the effects to each other. That was the central argument, the criticism they had. And then in 2016, they published the paper called The End of Framing. And this paper, as you can see, has been cited widely, and was not the only paper that was criticizing framing on this accord, but it was probably most impactful, and it really led to a noticeable shift and a very dramatic change in decline in use of framing as a concept from then on. So people were really tired of it, and people kind of couldn't agree. A lot of people agreed with Iyengar's argument on equivalency, that this was the only true framing and everything else was just a diluted mess. I don't quite agree. I understand from a psychological point of view that this makes a lot of sense. But to be honest, even the most basic arguments of gain and loss framing have been put into question since then in the replication crisis of psychology. So we can talk a little bit about that. But I wouldn't say a response to that shouldn't be the abandonment of the theory. And actually, Cacciatore makes a couple of suggestions of how things could develop further, but actually people didn't take them up. I think because they didn't know how, or they didn't know how to change their concepts of framing, how frames in the news, for example, really looked like. But after that, we saw only very, very little theoretical conceptual thinking on what frames and what news frames are. So this was really the end from the production side. And then people started hating the experiments. So Kinder, for example, wrote this very well-known short piece in Journal of Communication called Curmudgeonly Advice, where he said, you have to all stop doing all these short-term, terrible framing experiments that show minimal, small effect sizes that can't explain anything from an external or ecological validity point of view. What are you doing? You have to put framing effects into context. Nobody's looking at longevity. Nobody's looking at linkage and all these things. What's going on? And the problem is that this was more or less paired in timing then in the 2010s when we had these conceptual unclarities. So the problem is people never really came up with a better methodological idea. I mean, I, again, tried to do these longitudinal experiments in my dissertation. They worked, sometimes they didn't work, yeah. That was one way, but again, even longitudinal experiments have still quite limited time frames and have a lot of contingencies there. Then there were people trying to look at computational methods, and that also happened a little bit, but that was also clashing with the conceptual question, how complex do frames need to be, and can we really measure that using computational methods and so on. So there was a lot of methodological insecurity, and I would say that prevails up to now, and it's even worse now when we are facing so many problems anyway with measuring media exposure and media effects in a digital environment. And then the third reason was that people were simply oversaturated. So a lot of people, and I remember one of the editors of what's it, the journal? So one of the bigger journals said to me, "I cannot see. Please don't send me any framing papers anymore. Not to me personally, but like there's so many of them, people overuse the concept. They apply it to everything. It fits everywhere. And those of you who teach might have also noticed this when you teach students, that students tend to use and overuse framing quite easily because it explains arguably so much, but also then very little in a sense, right? So people love the concept, specifically people who have very little interest in theoretical development. So it was overused, it was overstretched, and there was lots of fights about concepts and methods, and then it just kind of went away. People started using it, and there was a real kind of decline. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in a little bit, to hear a bit about how you're using framing, if you're using it, and where you see the future of it going. Because, and then that also applies to me. After 2016, a lot of us kind of fled the ship a little bit and moved on from there, and thought of other ways of explaining the world. Now, a little caveat before I come to this like future idea of like what can we still take away from this. Of course, a lot of other things changed as well since 2010, right? So we have very new problems that might interest us in political communication that might not be answerable using framing. So the next big theory that came after framing were theories of polarization, of selective exposure, and these didn't have a lot of room for framing as a kind of more classic frame media effects theory. So that might also be a challenge. And then we come now to, the questions of AI, of disinformation, and I'll come back to that in a second. How can framing be used there? So there seemed to be also very little room for this classic idea of exposure and effect, even if it was advanced. And that might also have led to the decline of many other framing or media effects theories in our field, in political communication in particular, which is not the case in other fields, right? So such as health communication or media effects research, media entertainment research, where the development of the media effects theories has gone on continuously since then. So I would argue that in political communication, we have a real problem with the media effects theories these days. No more agenda setting, priming, framing. What do we replace these theories with when we try to understand how people interact or experience political information today in this very changed environment? But I would argue that actually framing can still do a lot there. Maybe not to the same extent as it did in the past. I would still argue that you should teach your students framing for various reasons, not only as a historical view, also, by the way, makes me feel quite old to teach something about classics, but okay, that's a different conversation. So just 5 ideas of how I think framing could be used. The first one is the news framing or framing theory is very closely connected to ideas of journalism, because in our field, it has specifically developed to understand what agency political journalists have in the framing process vis-a-vis political elites. So who sets the frame? Who builds the frame? Is it the political elites or is it the journalists? Now, obviously, this is no longer such an easy conversation, right? For various reasons that you're all aware of. It has to do with direct communication of politicians with citizens through social media and digital media. It has to do with the decline of the journalistic field and the challenges many journalists face today. It has to do with questions of how people should use and experience news, and whether news that come from journalists are actually maybe too negative or drive them away to avoid things. But specifically this decline in these challenges, this crisis of journalistic political production actually brings back questions of news framing and agency. So if journalists no longer set the frames, then who does? And what roles do other agents or even non-human agents face in frame building and frame setting? Also, do journalists retain the agency they previously had over political actors in setting certain frames or in distributing certain frames? And that connects us to the second idea. What's the interaction between framing and disinformation? I'm assuming a number of you are interested in disinformation and misinformation, fake news perhaps. The question of framing here is really an relevant one. You can use framing, specific framing, emphasis framing, but also other forms of frames to understand the structure of disinformation in public discourse, both in traditional media or online media. But you can also use framing effects to understand how people interpret and adapt to disinformation. So a lot of other theories are actually used to understand why people, choose to believe certain things and not others. But framing might also be quite useful there and has not really been used, to be honest, and which I find surprising. And then the third suggestion I would make is that frames, or specifically people's individual frames they have in their minds, are quite interesting to understand news avoidance as well, which also interests many of us. So why do people turn away from political information? And they might do so because of the frames that they have, not specifically about news, but about certain topics. It might be that certain ways media use to frame things either aid or can help in reducing news avoidance. So an interaction here between framing and interventionist framing specifically to reduce news avoidance has not been pursued in research so far. And then, of course, like with many other contexts, we have an opportunity to test framing effects now on a wider range of dependent variables. Traditionally, framing effects were measured based on what are the effects of frames on issue interpretations, attitudes, maybe behavior. Then came framing effects and emotions. But these days, well-being and other relevant dependent variables need to be studied and have not been studied. And so we don't really quite know what the framing effects process looks like vis-a-vis these new types of dependent variables that also interest us now in political communication. And then the last question, and therefore I ask you to please help me solve a problem I couldn't solve in my own dissertation, which was the question of how can we model time in framing effects? Arguably, the question of temporal effects is a very fundamental problem we have in communication research. When do media effects develop? How long do they last? When do we best observe them? How do we find methods to look at long-term and complex media interaction and media effects? And that is also true for framing effects. So I tried a couple of these longitudinal designs. They had a lot of problems. There are, of course, other methodological developments that can be used here, but I would say if you're interested in temporal effects and long-term effects of media or mediated communication, then framing effects might also be a theory that can be used to try to understand how long political communication influences people. But these are, of course, only just some ideas that one could have about how framing could be still used. I'm interested to hear if you have any more. But I hope you enjoyed kind of my a little bit my grandma's tale, maybe, of how framing has developed in my view. And I hope that you can take away a couple of things from this talk. First, that framing theory is a classic theory of political communication. We need to teach it. We need to keep on understanding it. I think it should not be abandoned. I think it has strong explanatory value, but it is in need of strengthening and development so as not to become a relic. There are other relic theories that we might think of that we only teach now in the introduction to communication as a kind of historical view. I don't think framing should be on that list. It's a way to explain why communication influences people, and that's essentially what we want to know, right? And it is an extent a victim of overuse and a decline in theorizing in our field. I think there is a real decline of theorizing in our field happening. That's not just because of we can't just see that with framing, we can see that with all theories. It might have to do with technological innovation. It might have to do with challenges that we all face in the social sciences with funding and these type of things. But framing was one of the first victims of this decline in theorizing. And I hope that I have interested you to this theory, and I hope really looking forward to your questions. There's also a book that Claes and I wrote about framing that came out in 2018. It's open access, so you can just download it, called News Framing Effects. If you just Google it and click on the link, it's free for you to read, and I look forward to hearing your comments about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie, for this very insightful discussion about framing. I think you already touched upon a lot of aspects of the theory itself, the future of the theory, the concept, and the challenges that would be interesting to discuss. So let's open the floor for a Q&A. We still have 20 more minutes left.